So listen, I think we will go ahead and get started just because you all are here on time. I hope everybody gets some food. My name is David Harris. I'm with the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice. On behalf of Professor Brown Nagin and Dean Manning, I'm going to welcome you to Harvard Law School today. Those of you who know, I don't put a lot of stock in these in intros and bios and doing all that kind of stuff, and I just want to make a couple of comments. Our speaker today is really a rising scholar, a rising star of scholarship, and has done really important work. He's a former teacher. He's a high school teacher, but he's done a lot of work on international work with the World Bank, advising governments on the development of educational strategies. And from my perspective, a lot of the work that he's done has looked at the question of retaining black male teachers. This is how I first came to know Travis, and it's really important work. And he's more recently turned his attention to today's topic, which is really fascinating. But I will say that he was just on WBUR yesterday. Was it yesterday? And talking about the retention of teachers of color in the city of Boston. So his work, I'll let him explain his work, but it's actually, I think, really important work. It's at the intersection of a lot of things that we at the Houston Institute care about a great deal. And before turning it over to him, though, I will just announce that tomorrow we have another event. We have Jean Thea Harris in conversation with Professor Khalil Muhammad, talking about her new book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, a look at the civil uses and abuses and misuses of civil rights. And then on March 23rd, we will have former Minneapolis Mayor Betsy Hodges here with a couple of city councilors from Minneapolis, kind of talking about the efforts that she made during her tenure to reform the police department in Minneapolis. So finally, before turning it over to Travis, I have to, as always, give thanks and praise to my colleague Kelly Garvin for the work that she does in making these things happen, including the design of our posters and a lot of the details. So I'll embarrass her again and ask us to give her a little round of applause. So with no further ado, I want to turn it over to Professor, I forgot the name of your chair, but Professor Travis Whistle, the recipient of a named chair at Boston University School of Education.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So there's some false advertising here, not on Kelly's part. So the title of the initial talk was Policing and Teaching, and it was an article that I recently co-published with Marcel Mentor. But given this space, being at sort of Harvard Law School, I thought I should maybe change my talk a bit. In January, the new U.S. Attorney, Andrew Lelling, invited me to present at his office around my work around teaching diversity. And so I think given this space, right, this might be a bit more appropriate. Some of the work that that was sort of promised here will be captured here. Of all the civil rights for which the world has struggled and fought for 5,000 years, the right to learn is undoubtedly the most fundamental. The freedom to learn has been bought by bitter sacrifice. We must insist upon this to give our children the fairness of the start, which will equip them with such an array of facts and such an attitude toward truth that they can have a real chance to judge what the world is and what its greater minds have thought it might be. These words inform the work that I do. It informs the research that I do, and it informs my calling. These words by W.E.B. Du Bois. My work is situated at the sort of intersection of research, practice, and policy. And what I'd like to first do is to talk with you about how I've used my research, right, to inform practice and policy, and I'll end by leaving you all with some recommendations that I think the legal community, right, might take up if they are committed to this idea of a more ethno-racially diverse teacher workforce. In 2009, then Secretary of Education Arne Duncan goes to Morehouse. Morehouse, as you know, is the nation's only historically black all-male college and university. And Morehouse, Secretary Duncan says that it's troubling that less than 2% of the nation's teachers are black men. And he calls, and at Morehouse, he launches the department's black male teacher recruitment campaign, calling black men to the blackboard. Now, one of the reasons Secretary Duncan said that it was troubling is because there are more children of color. There are more children of color. There are more children of color, right, in U.S. public schools, about 50.3%, than there are white children. And yet the teacher workforce is predominantly white. So about 82% of all teachers in U.S. public schools are white, and about 50.3% of all students are of color. Specifically, 1.9% of all of the nation's teachers are black men. And of course, there is variation, right, across states. So nationally, while 82% of all teachers are white across the state, in the state of Massachusetts, about 93% of teachers are white in the state. So there is some variation, right, across states. If we do a deeper dive, we see in sort of neighboring districts around Cambridge, much of the greatest divide happens around Latinx teachers and students, right? So in the city of Boston, while only 11% of teachers identify as being Latino, 41% do. 41% of the students do in Boston. In Springfield, we see a huge divide between Latinx teachers and students. 7.6%. Teachers, 64 and 65%, right, in the city of Springfield, Worcester, and it sort of goes on and on and on and on. I recently wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post talking about this sort of demographic mismatch around the troubling shortage of Latino and black teachers and what to do about it. And one of the things that op-eds can afford, right, is that if you sort of click the comment section behind the sort of veil of anonymity, people are revealed their true selves, right? And this is a bit more artful than what was revealed, right? But essentially, people always ask, right, like, why does it matter, right? So what? There is this demographic mismatch between teachers and students. Are we saying that black teachers should have black students, or that white students should only have white teachers, or Latinx teachers should have Latinx students? Why does it matter? So at your table, I'm going to ask you just to, maybe with the folks at your table, are we in a situation, right, where we need Latinx teachers teaching Latinx students, or white teachers only teaching white students? Why should we care about this demographic mismatch? So at your table, grapple with that question, and then we'll come back.
In June, I actually was I don't remember what I said, but I think one of the things that bad intention. Yes, I think but it still has an effect. And I think as a child, like, I thought almost thought it was like cool that I had to exclusively just be taught by someone else. A proportion to times that I had to like reflect or sort of like had to like sort of motivate from my own to like make them understand, you know, was not something that I had the responsibility to do.
So we're going to come back. Let's come back in about 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. So what do people say? Gary, I know you were,
Yeah, so I'm not intimately familiar with the literature, but I know that there's been an emerging body of work around the benefits of race matching in classrooms. And so the idea being that black students with a black teacher will have increased achievement as measured by standardized tests, and that those results will be additive over years. So the longer a student has a teacher whose race matches their own, the larger the gains are over successive years. And then also the importance of seeing someone in a position of power who looks like you and who may or may not share a similar background as you is powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll share some of those data. Other people, what do other people say? Yeah.
My partner had great things to say, so I don't want to. But everyone benefits from, this is her speaking, not me, in terms of like intellectual disclosure, in terms of ideas, and then I'll build on that. But essentially, just those same idea, the same way that feminism is not just about women being good feminists. Everyone needs access to diversity. It's not just a people of color issue. It's also a white issue, so to speak. So everyone can benefit, and so it's important to make the dialogue more inclusive rather than exclusive, as if you're in a place that I can have it and understand it versus not. And then just building on that, at the same time, it's important to recognize some sort of the historical patterns and places and assumptions around that second comment there, that only white teachers can teach white students, in that it assumes that school is comfortable for all groups and a safe place, which isn't necessarily so. So in this idea we all benefit from diversity, it should also be recognized that different groups need different things.
Yes. Yeah. And full disclosure, our kids go to the same school.
Right, we share the same classroom.
Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. Other folks. Kelly, you were making a really interesting point about that somewhat builds off of Rachel's point. Do you mind sharing it?
I'm sorry.
Oh, I caught you.
I think I was just saying that it's important for children of color to have teachers who represent themselves teaching them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, to this sort of larger point, where we have less research, right, but that white children, that there is a sort of added value for white children. I can't help but think about one of an alumnus of this institution, former President Barack Obama, that some of the backlash, I suspect, right, that he might have had while in Congress, that gave people the audacity to say you lied or to the union, was this sort of cognitive dissonance that many white Americans had by having a black man serve and be the commander-in-chief. This black man wasn't picking up their garbage or driving them, right? He was their intellectual superior. He was their boss. He was their commander-in-chief. But in many of these, I wonder, right, if many of these Congress persons had teachers, black male teachers, growing up, then the cognitive dissonance of having this black man serve as their commander-in-chief might not have allowed them to say things like you lied. Typically, I ask, how many of you have had black male teachers? At BU, where I'm on the faculty, I've had students in their evaluations say, and I teach grads and undergrads, but I remember having grad students say, you are the first black male teacher I've ever had. And they have gone through, right, K12, they've gone through college, they're now in grad school. And for the first time in their life, they're having a black male teacher. And so it's not only the case that children of color potentially might benefit, right? But in this diverse democracy, right, we owe it to everyone to have access to different types of people who can teach them. But let's just go to the research and literature. I started to use this term added value. Those of you who might be familiar with policies under No Child Left Behind, President Bush, the Bush administration began using this term value added, which was a way to sort of quantify the effects of having a teacher's effectiveness, right? And that was often measured by scores, standardized test scores. I flipped that term, and I've started to use the term added value. And we have a long research base, right, that points to the benefits of students of color when taught by a teacher of color. Here are some of the qualitative research. So Monceau and Herrera talk about how Latino teachers draw on their Latino students' sort of cultural experiences to increase academic and social development. Marvin Lind has documented how black male teachers describe positive social beliefs about their black students. Gordon Lassen-Billings, who some of you may know, has coined this term culturally relevant pedagogy. Black teachers draw on their students' culturally relevant practices to increase learning. And Lara talks about Latino male bilingual teachers. Much of this research, this qualitative research, has been conducted often through sort of smaller studies, smaller ends, right? And much of this has pointed to the benefits, the social and emotional benefits, right, for students of color, black and Latino, when taught by a black or Latino teacher. Now, given some of President Bush's policies and more recently President Obama's policies around quantifying teacher effectiveness, we now have also access to large-scale data, right, that matches students' standardized test scores, right, with their teachers. So in many districts, a teacher is rated effective if they can increase the test scores of their students on standardized tests. Some researchers have started to do is they've now looked at how which teacher and how a teacher's race is associated, right, with improving students' test scores. And we now have very convincing evidence, right, quantitative evidence, that's causal in nature, that says that having a black teacher causes increases for black students from some of these policies. One of the first studies done was by Thomas D. Those of you who were in high school, maybe in the late 2000s, might remember very smaller high schools. Much of that came from a study that Thomas D. did that found that going to a small school was associated with somewhat of increased learning. But Thomas D. also looked at how black teachers, how they were able to increase the students of black students in the state of Tennessee, and found sort of positive relationships. Ozad looks at nationally representative data and found that their perception was associated with the race, that their race was associated with the race of the student that they taught. This study made a great deal of news a couple of years ago in Florida. The study found that across the state of Florida, that black students performed better or scored higher on the state tests when they had a black teacher. This was a recent study done that began to look at how all children, particularly white children, and their preferences for having a teacher of color. So this study found that all children, white children and children of color, talked about and preferred having a teacher of color. I mean, this is a study that you might have been referencing that looked at, particularly for black boys, that there were some long-term impacts, right, for having a black teacher. Not only were they less likely to repeat, but they were more likely to persist, graduate from high school, and attend college. So we have a long line of both strong qualitative and quantitative evidence that suggests, or that says, right, that black children in particular perform better in schools when they have a black teacher. And of course I say that what I'm not suggesting here is that there isn't a place for white teachers. So I grew up in New York City. I only had, well, particularly in high school, I had mostly white teachers. This is Miss Shapiro. Miss Shapiro was my 11th grade English teacher. And I remember when I was in 11th grade in New York City, big public school in New York City, Miss Shapiro made English and literature come alive. So I remember reading A Streetcar Named Desire. I remember Miss Shapiro getting up on a desk. You can imagine Miss Shapiro was about yay high, right? Getting up on a desk and yelling Stella. And I said, one day, I want to become an English teacher. The moment when I became an English teacher. Miss Shapiro, when I got my PhD, she and I went out for drinks. I recommend, you guys probably do that already, go to drink. Probably not, go to drinks with your teachers, but at some point you should go to, have drinks. You probably should have drinks with your current teachers, but former teachers, right? So I'm not saying that there isn't a place for white teachers, because in my own experience as a high school student, right, and the work that I do, Ms. Shapiro remains, right, one of my favorite teachers. But what I am saying is that given the data that suggests that black children, brown children, that they're able to increase learning when they have a same-race teacher, that we should really take seriously efforts to recruit teachers of color and try to identify barriers for more teachers of color to stay in the profession. As some of you may know, there are currently about 177 federal DSEG cases, right, that are currently open, that are about student and staff assignment. And so these are schools, school districts, right, that continue to have practices that do not encourage or support racial and ethnic diversity. Here are some leaks, right, in the teacher of color pipeline that I'd like to suggest that might influence why the role of the legal community, right, in increasing the number of teachers of color. I think the first leak comes with K12 disciplinary policies, and so I'm going to talk about that, right. And so first, we can't think about increasing the number of people of color in the teaching profession if we lose a disproportionate number of children of color in K-12 schools. I'm going to talk a bit about hiring practices and bias in hiring practices for particular schools and school districts. That becomes another leak. And then finally, I'll talk about this idea of retention. Now, to study this, David mentioned this, I designed a study on black male teachers in Boston public schools several years ago. I looked at why black men came into the profession, some of the differences in their school experiences, and how those experiences made them stay or leave the profession. I conducted 2 rounds of interviews, 27 black male teachers across 14 schools, in total 51 interviews lasting about 1 hour. Some of the data, the way that I got to the 27 teachers was previously I had surveyed all of the black male teachers in Boston public schools and found that there were black men who were different, that the number of black men in the building seemed to suggest that they had different types of experiences. And so maybe during Q&A I can talk about this term that I've coined, loners and groupers, right, to talk about the experiences of being the only black man versus being in a school with 3 or more black male teachers. But for now, I'll just talk about black men in the aggregate, right, and what I found. Let me just quickly talk about K12 policies. So across black and Latino students, and in particular boys, right, are suspended from schools. This is national data at a much higher rate, right? And so suspension is associated with, in many ways, right, not being able to graduate from high school. If we look, these data that are national, right, are similar to data across the state of Massachusetts. And so what you'll see here is that that for the last several years, black, again, and Latinx students are disproportionately more likely to be suspended, right, from schools. And so you can't think about increasing the pipeline of teachers of color if we're suspending people and we don't give them an opportunity to actually go to college. And so one of the things that we have to ask ourselves, right, as a former high school teacher, right, as someone who has 2 kids in public schools, right, that if we're suspending a disproportionate number of these types of children, there are 2 options, right? We can say that somehow these children are maybe something in the water, right? Something is wrong with them, or might there be something wrong with the system, right? And how teachers have been socialized to believe that these children are always problematic. When I interviewed the black male teachers in my study, they also talked about how they felt that the black children in their schools were being policed in ways that were harmful. Dante Little, who was a teacher at a turnaround school in Boston, he talked about, actually, right around this time, this is the MCAS. MCAS, as you know, it's a state test. So students are taking the MCAS right now. And so he talked about how while students were sitting in class taking the MCAS, he had collected all the cell phones from students. Students were sitting down, taking their MCAS. An assistant principal, who was of color, right, comes into his classroom and says, have you collected all of the cell phones? And he says, yes. The assistant principal did not believe that he had collected all the cell phones. So while students were taking their tests, the assistant principal stops and begins to frisk the backpacks of all the students to make sure that indeed all the cell phones had been collected. Dante Little says, this is a microcosm of what it's like to go to school here. This isn't a prison. We can't treat our kids like they are criminals. Right? And so what we have in many large urban districts that are concentrated by students of color is that there is this idea that we continue to treat and police them and don't give them tools and resources to even enter college because we are policing and disproportionately suspending and expelling them before they can even make a choice of whether they should go to college. And so for those, so I think that the legal community should take very seriously the disproportionate rate at which black and brown children are being suspended because we're not even giving them the opportunity to even become teachers, potentially, if that's what they so choose. The second leak in this pipe is around hiring practices. There's a growing bit of, there's a slow growing bit of data around bias that's happening, particularly as it relates to teacher hiring. This study looked at black teachers in one Virginia school district and found that black teachers were being steered, right, towards schools that had many more black children. So these black teachers were actually going to interview at much more wealthier schools, high SES schools, but they were being steered and not given jobs at those schools and steered towards schools that had larger numbers of black children. When I looked at the data, so the Boston Public Schools gave me the race of all of the principals. So you see the principals race: black, white, Latino, Asian. And then they gave me the number, and then because I knew, they also gave me where the number of black male teachers at each of the schools. So if a school, for example, Red, 0, did not have a black male teacher on the faculty, that school was more likely to be led by a white principal. So 56%, right, of the schools in Boston Public Schools, again, this is only 1 year's worth of data, but 56% of the principals, right, in Boston Public Schools who were the white principals in Boston Public Schools were leading schools that did not have a black male teacher on the faculty. When we looked at schools that had 3 or more black male teachers, right, those schools were more likely to be led by a black principal. We know that there's bias in terms of hiring. Diva Pager, who wrote The Mark of a Criminal Record, right, she found that a white man with a criminal record had a higher likelihood of getting a job than a black man with a college degree. So we know that bias happens outside of the teaching profession. We're now starting to get some evidence that this 1-year blip, right, and some of these data here are not by chance, that black teachers, right, They may be choosing to only work in schools with large numbers of black teachers and black students, but they also might be steered to those schools and not given job opportunities at other schools. When I interviewed the black male teachers in my study, so I think I mentioned to you that I had black men in two types of schools. I had black men who were in schools where there were one, and those schools tended to be the higher performing schools, and I had black men in schools where there were three or more. Those tended to be the more struggling schools, right? So I asked Josiah Washington, who was the only black male teacher on his school, what he did to try to increase the number of other black teachers and male teachers. And so he joined the hiring committee, and he said that he had brought in some candidates who had worked at his previous school who were strong candidates. And when he was on the hiring committee, and they began to evaluate these candidates, the candidates that he had suggested, his colleagues said that they weren't a good fit, right, for the school. And so he says, I was the only male of color. I wanted to see if there was a way to have more males, whether they be of color or not. And after we finished doing all the hiring, I really felt as though my opinion wasn't garnered, because we ended up having all females, and my push was for males. So in this this qualitative finding begins to support some of these larger studies that in many ways teachers of color, right, in this case male teachers of color, are choosing to apply to schools that have higher working conditions, that are supportive, or that they think might be a good school. But the hiring committee and the people on the hiring committee, right, are not seeing these individuals being a good fit, right? And so it might be important to understand and examine bias that happens across hiring, right? And how individuals who are in charge of hiring are choosing whom to hire and whom not to hire. And finally, I want to talk about this last idea of retention. As David mentioned, the WBUR and yesterday the Fox 25, right? People have been asking me about, where do I see, what can the state do around this issue? And I say that everyone wants to focus on recruitment. Everyone wants to get a nice, flashy campaign and get some dollars around, let's get people in. But what districts need to do actually, right, is pay attention to retention. Because what we find is that we're seeing an increasing number of teachers of color actually come into the profession. So many of these recruitment campaigns are paying off, right? So right now I'm working with New York City. It's my main project. If any of you have been to New York City, you may have seen this thing called NYC May Teach. Right, so I work with the city to design this thing, and it's nice. But the city has also begun to also think about how you support people and how you retain people. But many districts are just really focusing only on this recruitment piece and not on the retention piece. And that's where, and what we find is that teachers of color are coming into the profession, but they're leaving at a higher rate than their peers. So the Albert Schenker Institute, which is a research arm of the American Federation of Teachers, looked at teacher turnover across several districts over the course of 10 years. And they found, that black teachers, for example, Boston, were leaving, 18%, were leaving, at a much higher rate, than white teachers. And that one of the primary reasons why we're seeing this demographic, or continue to see this demographic mismatch, is because teachers of color are leaving at a much higher rate than their peers. Let me. Now some of the reasons for that turnover, some people have suggested could come in the way of discriminatory evaluations. So in many school districts, teachers are evaluated, one, on their test scores, on how they increase test scores for their students, and also from the qualitative feedback that their principal gives them. And so in Boston several years ago, this is the former superintendent, but the union had charged that black teachers were being negatively evaluated, at a much higher rate than white teachers. And so if you have routine negative evaluations, then it becomes less likely for you to keep your job. From my study, Hugh Ferguson, who received an undergraduate degree from MIT and a master's degree from Harvard. He's a math teacher at one of the exam schools. Lost his job in the second year. He was excessed, right? So his position was cut. He says, I graduated from an elite institution. Many people actually have a tough time understanding blacks who have graduated from this elite institution. It's MIT. Because they know that MIT means you are intelligent. Either they accept that you really did accomplish quite a bit, or they're forever jealous, and you never move past that. And so one of the things that Hugh Ferguson talked about, right, was at one point he actually talked about many of his colleagues thought that he was a spy for the district. They could not believe that a black man with an undergraduate degree from MIT and a master's degree from Harvard would actually want to teach at this school. It was a great deal of cognitive dissonance. They couldn't wrap their heads around why he would want to do this thing. Then he talked about having to constantly manage their white fragility, right, their white insecurity. And finally, in his second year, right, this black man, right, teaching math at an exam school, right, where the district is struggling to get children of color into the school to begin with, was excessed. So his position was cut because, according to the principal, they had lost funds for his position. In this school, I'd interviewed two other black male teachers, and the other black male teacher said that the following year they had actually replaced, they actually hired someone else. They hired a white woman in that position. So I think that there are these three, particularly for folks in the legal space. If you really want to lean in and think about how you begin to address this issue of increasing the number of teachers of color, I think that there are these three places in the pipe that I would suggest that you think about focusing your energy. K12 disciplinary policies, right, that disproportionately push out black and brown children so they don't ever have a chance to become teachers, they don't have a chance to go to college. Bias in terms of the hiring practices, so school districts or schools, or central office people who, when people apply, steer people into some of the most challenging schools, thinking that there'll be black men and black superwomen, right, without giving them the conditions or the tools to be successful in those spaces. And also bias in terms of hiring. So when black people are applying to work in places like Belmont or Brookline, these hiring committees are saying that these teachers are not a good fit. And then thinking also about retention, right? So what are the conditions in schools that are actually ensuring that black teachers are staying, and what might be some challenging practices or policies that push these people out. So, as I said, here are some recommendations that I shared with the U.S. Attorney, and I'll share them with you all in hopes that somebody listens and will take them up. Identify these K12 disciplinary policies, as I mentioned. So I think that in the legal space, identifying districts and schools, and then working with those districts and schools with plans to reduce this disproportionality. Hiring practices. I think that working with the Department of Education, DESE, to identify hiring practices and then identify discrimination in these practices, and working with local and school unions maybe to develop a confidential portal for teachers to report hostile racial workplace environments. And so I'm hoping, and I have to always thank the funders, the people who allowed me to eat while doing this work. But I'd love to open up for Q&A if folks have questions, thoughts, comments, criticisms. I'm open to them all. Thank you. Yeah.
So thank you so much for this. I had a question around retention.
Yeah.
And so I know that you spoke a lot about, maybe some things happening on the administrative end that results in black teachers and black male teachers not being retained. I'm wondering if there was any sort of, expressed on the part of your participants, any sort of opt-out where, they left teaching because of any number of reasons, by choice. I'm specifically thinking about the disciplinary practices that you talked about before, and maybe frustration with those. Could you just speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so the primary reason why all teachers say that they leave their schools is because of poor administrative leadership. So they say that because of a dysfunctional principal, that they choose to leave their schools. The issue is that teachers of color, and I'm specifically thinking about Black and Latinx teachers, that they're concentrated in these schools. So they are most likely to teach in these dysfunctional schools. And they point to not having the resources to teach, having to teach in very scriptive and sort of prescriptive ways. And all of those experiences make it challenging for them to stay in the profession. Teachers of color are both stay in the profession and stay in their schools. One of the things that we also know is that teachers of color, that they move from school to school a lot. So they're more likely to be what's called a mover, right, than a leaver. So white teachers on average will leave the profession out of frustration with the profession. But teachers of color are more likely to keep on moving they hop from school to school to school because of, on average, this sort of commitment to the communities that they want to serve. Does that answer?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Gary. Yeah, Rachel.
I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about school culture in general and how your research fits in. As a mother of 3 boys, I have become very anti-school. I think that school is very much a feminine culture. And even in the example you provided, I would argue that there's sort of potentially a female model of leadership. So can you just sort of talk both about how this work sort of fits within a larger issue in terms of, from my perspective, not providing boys sort of adequate opportunities more generally for sort of who they are as learners, and then the role that you sort of see your work does with that, or sort of the relationship between those two.
Yeah. So I'm gonna keep it only. I mean, I feel like I can talk because this is research talk. I feel like I want to keep it sort of empirically based. I can talk anecdotally about the student piece from being a former teacher and someone now I train teachers, right, in my current job. I don't really do research on this area. I do think that we have not thought about how we differentiate learning for teachers of color. So in lots of schools, right, the lingua franca is differentiating learning for all types of children. Children of color. There's this term called culturally relevant pedagogy. So we're now really giving attention to how we create different types of learning experiences for the children, but we have not given thought to thinking about how we create different type of learning experiences for the adults based on their social location, based on some of their lived experiences. So some of the work that I've started to do now with districts is to help them, this term called differentiating professional development. Right? So this idea is that given that teachers of color are having these different school-based experiences, what then might be the learning experiences that we might need to create for these teachers that allow them to develop professionally. And so some of that work has to first happen with helping principals understand some of their own, everyone uses this word, unconscious bias, implicit bias, it's just racism, sexism. But how do we help adults understand their isms? Yes, it might be easy to ask the one black male teacher to go and cover the yard or walk the hallway. But at what cost to that person is that black male teacher always having to be the de facto police officer, right? And so lots of my work is helping the adults, the school principals, understand their own bias, so that they don't position black teachers and black male teachers in very damaging ways. So this paper is actually, it's on this idea, right? That black male teachers are positioned in ways that make them police more than they do teach. And my sense is that white teachers are thinking, when I send these black boys to this black male teacher, like they think it's a good thing, right? Like, this person needs a role model, right? But what these black men say is that what they're doing isn't magical, right? They're just asking, where'd you eat? How's your grandmother? How's your mother, right? How are you doing? They're not doing anything that's magical. They're just getting to know their student. But these white teachers think that there's some sort of magical connection that these black men have. And so some of my work now is not only helping the principals think about how they are positioning these black male teachers, but also white teachers, right, who are well-intentioned, understand that, if you just got to know your student a little bit better, right, maybe you wouldn't have all of these disciplinary practices or disciplinary problems. So that's the kind of work that I'm doing at the adult level to sort of think about the school organizational context, right, and how the adults might create conditions for all adults to teach. Yes, and your name?
Sorry?
Your name?
Oh, my name is Kayla.
Kayla.
Thanks so much for coming this evening and sharing your research. You spoke a little bit about like how administration is like a lot of times the reason why the teacher or black male teacher will leave the school. But I was wondering what insight you may have into the social dynamics of like the teacher communities, because I know in high school there are like cliques between the teachers. And I can imagine that like in a majority like white female teacher population that like a black male like wouldn't be as likely to hang out with the other teachers after school and things like that. So does that play a role into the teaching stuff?
No.
Okay.
So my study that I did, I compared men who were the one to the men who were 3 or more, right? So the men who were the one were more likely to teach in schools that were higher performing. They had many more white teachers, more white students. And these men talked about those places being hostile. I mean, almost, it was emotionally taxing on me after I interviewed people, right? When they recall the kinds of things that happened to them. So one man talked about, coming back with a bout of prostate cancer and being incontinent, and sitting in at a faculty meeting, right? And so it was a urine or something, and a white colleague came and sprayed perfume on him, right? Another black male talked about sitting in a faculty meeting and having a white teacher say, so these are all men who were by themselves the one, having a white female teacher say, use the N-word. She was saying, she was repeating what another student had said, but she actually said the N-word. Then she said she said effing. And so when he said, you said the N-word, no problem, but then you bleeped out the word effing, right? And he asked her, why'd you do this? And she said it was against her religion to curse, right? So it was okay to say this one word. But these men talked about being in these very challenging, hostile spaces. And when I moved back with them, they stayed in their schools because they had come to expect that racism exists. As a black man living in America, you know that racism exists. But at least in these schools where there were more white students, more white children, more resources, they could at least teach. So in many ways, these men suffered in silence, knowing that racism existed. The men who were in schools of 3 or more, those were the men who were more likely to leave. So even though they were around more colleagues, right? Because people told them how to teach, and because people policed their kids, those places became challenging places in which to teach. And it was, in many ways, a counterintuitive finding, that men who were in places that were like hostile in some ways, that they stayed, but they were aware, right, that racism just exists. And so I know it exists, but at least I can teach my children. And so the influence of peers became less of a contributing factor, and the primary contributing factor was the administrative leadership. And so that's why the men who were in schools of 3 or more, that's why those men left. Thank you. Yes, here. We'll hear them. Yes.
Okay.
And your name?
The first, I'm Lauren Gibbs, and the first thing is, my AP history teacher for European history was a black male teacher. My kid in 6th grade, her math teacher was a black male teacher. That's number one.
That's rare.
No, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Number two, white kids also learn better from teachers of color. And I've forgotten the name of the research, but there's research been done to say that white kids also learn better from teachers of color.
Yeah.
And now I'm forgetting my point, which was, I'm forgetting it. Maybe go to somebody else.
Yeah,
and I'll
but I think that
come back to
your point is correct, because I mentioned this finding here that the second to last, Sherman and Halpin, that they talk about how all students, right, white and students of color, right, talked about this preference for so thank you for that. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Hi, it's
And sorry, your name?
my name's Novelette, and I'm actually from the UK.
Yeah.
My question it's a question and a statement in that it's interesting hearing what you're saying about black male teachers' experience, because we have similar situations in the UK. I don't know if you've done any comparative study or research yet. And I was wondering if anything's being done to recognise or research the trauma that those teachers experience, and if there is any kind of intersection with the UK and the US of bringing the black male teachers together, because I know two at the moment, one in particular who's having a very traumatic experience in doing his teacher training in the UK, in London, being placed in a very white space and having to navigate and manage that. I was actually, by default, ended up mentoring him and giving him some kind of positive encouragement, because he felt very isolated. And I just wondered around the research that you've done if there's any comparative study being undertaken, and because those two examples you gave are very distressing.
So this summer I was in France working with the OECD, the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, and so they administer, the PISA. This is a test, everybody. So they have been, there's a policy working group there that I've been part of that's been bringing together primarily member states, primarily folks across Europe. Canada has come. But we're thinking about issues around diversity. One space, right, that we've thought about is the sort of like teacher diversity. And so we've had, so this idea, right, and if you send me an email, I can send you that policy paper that they published. This is something that European nations are grappling with as well. When I presented the same research in Paris in September, a colleague of mine, black in the Netherlands, talked about some of the experiences of being black in the Netherlands and going through teacher training. That was very much to what you're saying. So people are talking about it. I'm working on a book project where I'm going to invite individuals from across Europe, across states in the US and the districts, to talk about how they are working towards supporting teachers of color. I have a colleague in England. Her name is Alana Gay. She started this program called BAM-Ed. It's called Black Minority Ethnic Teachers or something. But if you let's follow up, because I think you should be connected to this. So she created this teacher professional development group for black and minority educators in England. And so they meet, I think, once a year to sort of share some of their challenges. So the same conversation, the same data that I presented here when I was in Paris and in many European countries, Germany specifically, right? They are grappling with this same thing, given the sort of the demographic shift that's happening because of what's happening in the Middle East. So people are, I think, particularly in Europe, are grappling with this as well. Yes. Oh. You remember your, yeah.
I do remember
Okay.
your question. I interviewed 15 to 20 people of color at my daughter's high school, Cambridge Rindge and Latin, 2 years ago, asking them how they were hired, how they were retained or not, or whether they were leaving, and so forth and so on. And one of the things that came out was something that I want to ask whether you suggest people do or not, which is that the kids were saying, this teacher is great. And the administration would not necessarily have the same opinion. And to give the ideas of the students who cared about those teachers and who enjoyed those teachers, that should be part of the evaluation, and that should be included in what a teacher's evaluation is. It shouldn't just be the administration, it should be what the students have to say also.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's in places that are, I think that when we change the makeup of the decision makers, we change the makeup of people who are invited to come to play, right? And so I think that if the teachers aren't ethno-racially diverse, then we need to think about the students and parents. So I think that having students be part of, and more particularly I think parents, be part of hiring committees is an important first step. But we also have to actually ensure that their voices are heard, give them power to make those decisions. Yes, sir, in here.
So I have 2 siblings who are both public school teachers here in Boston.
Oh, wow.
And my brother is very rare to see a male black teacher in Boston. He's had more success with private schools and with charter school recruitment because he doesn't have a degree in higher education to be a teacher, to join the union. Are you seeing different numbers for students who are going to charter schools as well? And the other part is actually asking about a lot of friends in Los Angeles, where I'm from, they actually work, again, because they don't have, like, say, a degree in education, they work as classroom assistants. So there's a lot of, say, males of color in the classroom who are there as more of a part of that policing aspect, who are there to monitor children with, say, somewhere on the spectrum, who might have violent outbursts. And so they're expected to, say, restrain that child, who are expected to be that mitigating factor, but they're not seen as equals in that school setting. Have you seen any of those kind of numbers as far as Latino, black male students on campuses who are not maybe in that teacher role as well?
So to your first question, black teachers are more likely, there are a higher percentage of teachers of color in charter schools, right, than there are in district schools. And some of that has to do with not needing a credential. The idea of teacher licensure, so in Massachusetts, like in many states, you need to pass a teacher certification exam. And that is a barrier, right, for teachers of color. We also know historically that those teacher certification exams came about right after Brown. So when black children began going into schools with their white peers, when their black teachers began to follow them into their schools, southern states created these certification exams. Right? And so so my question is, and there's also research, particularly around the praxis. We don't do praxis in this state, but around the praxis, researchers looked at teachers who passed the exam, teachers who did not pass the exam, right, on their first try, and then how those teachers increased students' test scores on standardized exams, and they found that there was no difference between passing the exam and increasing students' test scores. So one of the questions I ask is that if we have disproportionality in anything, right, we need to wonder why that is, and if there is a very weak, if passing the exam, the teacher certification exam, is a very weak measure for increasing students' test scores, then why do we have the test to begin with, right? So one of the reasons why we have this a higher number of folks of color in charter schools is because of the certification requirement. And charters also hire early. Folks of color really want to teach. We do have lots of, to your second question, there are lots of people of color and women of color are more likely to be paras. That becomes actually a really great pipeline. So what Cambridge is doing is they've gotten a grant to do some work at BU to give credentials to the paras so they can get licensed to then become teachers. So there are a couple of para professional programs across the state. There's one in Springfield, Amherst area. So we're seeing some of these para programs. So that can be a very nice pipeline program. Do you have a question?
Yes. So my question was...
And your name, sorry.
Chanel.
Chanel.
I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, actually. So my question was, if your recommendations around the leakage in K12 and the disciplinary policy were implemented in more African-American young men with ultimate education, K12 would have a better experience and go into college and graduate, do you think the interest would be there to be a teacher, given that teaching doesn't really pay well and all of this toxic stuff that you're talking about that exists in the environment?
Great question. So New York City is proving, right, through this program called NYC and Teach, that it's all about marketing. So I don't know if you know, sometimes Charlemagne the God, folks know Charlemagne? Some people from New York, right? So Charlemagne the God is a radio personality, right? So Charlemagne and I sat on a panel for NYC and Teaching, and on the radio in New York.
That's what I heard the announcement.
Right, yeah. So you have this radio personality that people listen to. And I remember interviewing a guy, because my project is this project in New York, and he asked me, well, why did you decide to become a teacher? I was listening to the radio one day, right? And someone said. So I think part of it is really about marketing, right? That I don't think that we've done, we haven't marketed teaching as a profession to folks of color, because on average, people of color recognize that they've come to college and they feel like this sense of wanting to give back, right? So I was talking to someone earlier today, and she was saying she wants to be an entertainment lawyer and wants to work with black entertainers because they've been sort of, screwed, essentially, right? So I think that people of color, on average, want to give back to their communities and don't think about teaching we haven't marketed teaching as a potential option, right, as a viable option. So I think that some of this really has to do with marketing. I think that also we have to make it clear to teachers, that there are incentives to forgive loans, right? I mean, I think that there has to be a package marketing campaign that helps people think about teaching as a viable option. So with that, if you want to, I'll give you my email and Twitter handle. Feel free to stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do encourage you to hit him up with your questions.